A provision in a bill before the United States Congress could tie the U.S. and Israeli militaries far more closely together, deepening their cooperation on weapons research, production, and technology. The proposal, titled the United States-Israel Defense Technology Cooperation Initiative, appears as Section 224 of the House Armed Service Committee's version of the fiscal year 2027 National Defense Authorization Act, the annual U.S. Defense Policy Bill. The measure is still at an early stage. The NDAA is passed by Congress each year to set U.S. military policy and authorize defense programs and spending levels. If enacted, the provision could mark a significant change in one of the world's closest military relationships, shifting the two countries from a partnership centered largely on U.S. military aid towards one in which their defense industries are more deeply intertwined. I'm pretty sure something like 30% or 33% of the Israeli military is directly funded through U.S. support. The U.S. and Israeli defense forces have done cross-training for years and years, much prior to recent Gaza stuff. They've engaged in lots of cross-training exercises, lots of shared information. I know a lot of our efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s, military planes were launched from places in Israel and Jordan and whatnot. And so there's a historical connection here between the U.S. and Israel militarily. This is not necessarily just a recent thing. Section 224 would require the U.S. Defense Secretary to appoint an executive agent, a single official to coordinate military cooperation between the U.S. and Israel. That work would cover joint research and development, the shared production of weapons, and the linking of military systems and data. In a lot of ways, it already is. Maybe this just sort of formalizes or expands on programs that are sort of already in place. Look, I'm not necessarily against us allying ourselves with some place like Israel, right? I think our allyship with Israel from a strategic perspective is actually kind of important. It gives us a foothold in the Middle East that we otherwise wouldn't have. We are the big dog in the relationship, right? We're the big brother, they're the little brother. But when they're leading the charge on the Iran war that Trump has signed on to the last year or so, it's clear that Israel is leading, is the big dog, is the big brother in that relationship, and we're more the little brother, which is not the dynamic that should be there. I am totally okay with there being some sort of allyship, some sort of military partnership, right? It should make Americans safer abroad and domestically. If we're going to do that, and especially if we're going to provide them so much military support like we currently do, then we should have some sort of say about their foreign policy efforts, how they're handling things like Gaza and the West Bank and fighting in southern Lebanon and Syria and, potential territorial expansions. We should have some say in all of that, I would think. But not to the extent that it's exploitative, right? I could see some bad faith actors arguing, well, that's that's exploitation. You should let Israel handle their own area or whatever, right? And I think for the most part, yes, but to an extent. If we are providing 30% of their military budget, and they're going to use that military for things that are bad, for things that are morally incorrect and that hurt U.S. interests domestically and abroad, potentially make Americans less safe domestically and abroad, then we do necessarily should have a say in it. That absolutely makes sense. What Congress is trying to do now is find different ways of entrenching the relationship so deep in America's own defense industrial base that it's impossible to root it out. Josh Paul, a former U.S. Department of State official and founder of the advocacy group A New Policy, said about the controversial provision. Well, I don't know if that's the explicit intention of all this, but it's certainly a side effect that the people pushing for this and defense industry executives sure aren't mad about, and that they would love if it ended up playing out. A new section of law in the National Defense Authorization Act would give Israel unprecedented access to American technology and would force the United States military to integrate Israeli defense technologies into our own critical military supply chain, giving Israel incredible leverage over America's own defense priorities. Well, this sort of speaks to strategic decisions about military industrial production and things like that, right? Classical reasoning shows that you would want as much of your military capabilities to be produced internally for strategic safety. You don't want in some future situation for the relationship between Israel and the U.S. to sour for whatever reason, and then they somehow find themselves allied or tangentially related or connected to some one of our enemies who then like initiates some sort of attack on us or our allies. We don't want that conflict of interest to be there where it could potentially hamstring our ability or our military abilities domestically or abroad. And so as much as I'm in favor of allyship and healthy partnerships and sharing of military information and training and technology and all that stuff with another very advanced military power like Israel, I'm not necessarily for integrating our supply chains in that sort of way. I don't know if that's necessarily a good idea. If you could somehow prove that we're going to be allies till the end of time and that allyship will never prove to be harmful, then I would be in favor of this. But you can't promise those things. And even in the short term, those things could potentially change. So I don't think that this is a good idea. The two countries have already built missile defense systems together, such as the Iron Dome. I know a lot of the specific rockets and the funding for those rockets that they use in the Iron Dome system come directly from the U.S. military, come directly from bills signed by Congress. I guess a small little tidbit about the Iron Dome is that the Iron Dome is only for short-range missiles, right? They really only can stop sort of pot rockets and smaller artillery and short-range missiles and stuff sent like that, right? They can't stop ballistic missiles like sent by Iran and stuff. They have a totally different missile defense system called something Archer. They have a different sort of missile defense system, just like many U.S. military assets in certain cities do, to defend against more robust, long-range ballistic missiles, like the ones that were shot from Iran to Tel Aviv, a year ago or something like that, right? The Iron Dome isn't going to knock those down. It doesn't have the ability. Those missiles move far too fast. They're coming from too far away. They don't have the ability, and they're too big. They don't have the ability to do that, but they do have certain types of missile defense systems that can do that, and we have funded a whole lot of the Iron Dome for sure. The bill would extend their joint work into many more areas of modern warfare, from artificial intelligence to drones and cyber operations. The provision comes amid turmoil in the Middle East following joint U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran earlier this year. In February, U.S. and Israeli forces attacked Iran, triggering 5 weeks of war. Iran struck back at Israel and at U.S. bases in the Gulf region before a ceasefire took hold in April. Israel is also facing genocide allegations in a case brought by South Africa at the International Court of Justice, the top court of the United Nations, over its war on Gaza. From all of the information I've seen, I think it'd be hard to not call what they've done in Gaza some sort of a genocide based on how we traditionally define the word genocide. Now, does that necessarily mean giving the territory of Gaza or the West Bank outright sovereignty is a good idea? No. I don't think a two-state solution is possible anymore. Maybe at some point in the 80s or prior it would be possible, but too much specific things have happened that make it, I think, not a reasonable solution. I think maybe some sort of pseudo one-state solution could potentially work, but I don't think an outright separated sovereign two-state type solution could work at this point in time. You could argue, well, this was Israel's doing. You could argue that a lot of the things that they've done, foreign and domestic, to Gaza, to the West Bank, to Lebanon, to Syria, to Iran, is what has created the conditions that make a two-state solution unviable. That's a totally separate argument, but whether they have or they haven't, it doesn't change the fact that I would argue that a two-state solution at this point is unviable. That Israel is surrounded by countries that want to see them destroyed, right? Lebanon is largely run by Hezbollah, who has vowed that they want to see Israel wiped out, basically, and all the Jews killed, right? All the shit they've done to Gaza, the genocide that they've committed there, you've pissed off so many people there that there's no way that you could give them outright sovereignty and political power and the ability to gain a military, right? They're almost certainly going to start retaliating to you for what you've done to them and their families to some degree, in some regard, right? Look, it doesn't make the genocide that Israel has committed on Gaza okay, but you can't ignore the impact of it moving forward. The bill must first clear the House Armed Services Committee, which is due to take it up in early June and then pass the full House and the Senate. It was proposed by the committee's Republican chairman, Mike Rogers, and its most senior Democrat, Adam Smith, giving it support from both main parties, even as opinion polls suggest growing opposition among most Democrats and some Republicans to further military support for Israel. Yeah, that's why I was a little bit surprised initially when I saw this, because like the view of Israel and our support of them and our allyship and whatnot, especially amongst Democrats, has soured significantly. But I've even been seeing it quite a bit in Republican spheres, right, and conservative spheres as well. Now, I do tend to see that like the way it manifests in the conservative realm and Republican realm or whatever tends to be, it's a little too close to anti-Semitism for my liking. The U.S. has supported Israel's military for decades. Since 2008, U.S. law has required Washington to protect Israel's qualitative military edge, keeping its forces stronger and more advanced than those of any rival in the region, on the grounds that a small country must rely on better weapons rather than greater numbers. Israel beat out basically all of the major players in the region, and they have for decades and decades since their formation, right? And so, yes, there is a lot of, and they probably wouldn't be able to do that without U.S. military support, right? There is definitely some truth to the fact that their military is stronger and more advanced than basically any in the region, and that likely is one of the only things keeping them safe. I mean, imagine if Lebanon or if Iran had like parity, had military parity with Israel, right? It's very possible that they could seriously face being wiped off the map, being taken over, losing their sovereignty as a nation, right? Which would necessarily result in the deaths of millions and millions of innocent people, and obviously not a desirable outcome. Whether you think Israel has the right to exist or not, whether you think their formation was legitimate or not, doesn't really matter. They are a sovereign nation at this point, and I don't really see any possibility of them going away anytime soon, or going away anytime soon that doesn't involve the death of millions and millions of innocent people, which obviously is a horrible, horrible, undesirable outcome. Under the current aid deal signed during the administration of former President Barack Obama, Washington provides Israel with about $3.8 billion a year in military assistance. The 10-year agreement runs through 2028. Israel is the largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid since 1948. Almost all of it now military and worth more than $300 billion when adjusted for inflation. The nature of that support may now be changing. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said recently that he wants to end Israel's reliance on U.S. military aid within 10 years, saying his country had come of age. Closer cooperation between the two defense industries, rather than cash, would likely fit that goal. Yeah, that makes sense, right? We've built such a strong military, or not we've built, in cooperation with Israel, including U.S. military support. We've built such a strong military and technological foundation there that like that absolutely makes sense. That like they might not necessarily need just straight up cash injections anymore. They would need more qualitative type support, type agreements, type sharing of information and whatnot. So yeah, I'm kind of mixed about this. I am sort of on the surface in favor of stronger military allyship, or just allyship in general, with some place like Israel. Helps us, hold a foothold in the Middle East. Helps us potentially protect American interests and civilians, domestic and abroad. But I am not really in favor of intertwining our defense industries, our production, or military production capabilities, because it makes us too beholden to their interests. We want to have the ability to isolate ourselves militarily in some sort of a world war type scenario and be able to be self-reliant. I mean, imagine like some sort of world war breaks out, right? And Israel somehow gets nuked or bombed out of existence, right? All their industrial military capabilities get destroyed. Then, we would be weakened necessarily in that sort of scenario if we have this sort of like super intertwined industrial capabilities situation. So I think it makes far more sense for our military but our military industrial capabilities to be as isolated as possible while maintaining an allyship and relationship with Israel, strategically, technologically, training wise, allyship wise, etc.